thank you for joining us for the panel on environmental racism. This event is a part of a week-long series of events organized by the Graduate Institute and the University of Geneva aimed at promoting sustainability awareness and action. Our topic for today, environmental racism, is connected to a continued violent legacy of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation of land, resources, and people around the world. The inequalities and power dynamics of where power plants, landfills, toxic waste sites are located, who is most exposed to the harmful effects of pesticides, sea level rise, forced environmental migration, and who has access to clean energy, organic food, sustainable transportation, clean air and water, and agricultural systems are all issues of environmental racism. Today, we will be discussing with our panelists their perspectives about what are the most detrimental effects of environmental racism and what work is being done to push for equitable and just sustainability efforts. Our panelists for the event are Ms. Emily Kopar, the Community Program Manager at Los Angeles Audubon Society, a nonprofit organization that focuses on wildlife conservation through research, education, recreation, and habitat restoration. Emily leads many environmental education programs for varying audiences, from inner-city elementary school students to community college students. She was part of the very first intern cohort of the Baldwin Hills Greenhouse Program in 2008. Mr. Brian Young has been a key member of Los Angeles Audubon's restoration and education staff team since he graduated high school in 2011. He's an alumnus of the Baldwin Hills Greenhouse Program, and he completed his undergraduate degree in art at UCSC. Our next panelist, Ms. Rafaela Vargas, is a biologist and the Bolivian coordinator for the Southern Cone Conservation Chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology, an affiliate member of the Organization for Women in Science for the Developing World of UNESCO. She conducts research on socio-ecological systems, forest and agricultural ecosystem ecology, and climate change. Our final panelist, Mr. Breswara Wilson, is an Indian activist and one of the founders and national convener of the Safai Karamchari Andolan, which is an Indian human rights organization that has been campaigning for the eradication of manual scavenging, the construction, operation, and employment of manual scavengers, which has been illegal in India since 1993. Some housekeeping rules and suggestions for our attendees. We request you to put any questions you have in the chat box, which you will find at the bottom right of your screen. A member from our team will be monitoring the chat section to take note of all your questions, which will then be put up to the panelists. If you would like to address a question to a specific panelist, please mention it along with your question. To give everyone a chance to interact and reflect, we will be sending all the attendees into breakout session after the Q&A round. You will have a chance to hear directly from one of the panelists in the breakout session as well. Please note that the breakout rooms are assigned randomly by the system, and it would be great to hear your thoughts in the session, but your participation, of course, is entirely voluntary for you, and you are welcome to hear the thoughts of the other participants as well. Quick note for the panelists. Each member of the panel will have 2 to 3 minutes to answer each question. I will indicate by raising my hand when you have 1 minute left. If you face any technical difficulties or if you would like me to repeat the question, please feel free to let me know. So let's begin. For our first section, we asked our panelists to bring an item that to them is a symbol of environmental racism. So I would like each of our panelists to explain the item's significance to them on a personal or global systematic level, and with that, their perspective on what is environmental racism and what does it look like in the work they do. So let's begin with Emily.
Good morning, everyone. Well, good morning on my side of town. My name is Emily Kovar. Pronouns are she, hers, and hers. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, which is ancestral lands of the Tongva, Quiche. And one factor that contributes to environmental racism in my personal life and my work life is access to green spaces, and specifically in historically excluded communities. So in my background, I have what the city of LA is. And as you can see, it's all urbanized. A few of the little green spaces we have in the town of LA is either golf courses or they're cemeteries. For us, our local park, I highlighted right here in really small. The red part is what we have access to. That's where we can go hiking, where we can observe wildlife. And then what I highlighted in yellow is the Inglewood oil fields that were found that were established in the 1920s. And as of right now, there's 956 active oil wells. So even if we do have a little park space, it's still affected by the oil wells, um, either air quality or anything else, even just the views of it. We can't even enjoy it. But it has been scientifically proven that nature is positive impacts our physical and mental health. So that is one thing that in all of this is, we need more access to parks. Well, we do have mountains that you can have it pictured. You can't see it here, but those are really important to have access to. And fortunately, in my field of work, we provide free programming for people of all ages to learn the ecology of the Baldwin Hills. So that's what we call what I highlighted in red is what we call the Baldwin Hills. And we provide free programming for people either through free field trips that we offer for inner city schools. And we offer free college courses for people to learn about, the birds, to learn about reptiles, geology, and we use it with a lens in intersectionality lens. And we even provide paid opportunities for people to protect these places that we have here. And we do that through our high school program, which Brian, Deandra, and I went through in high school. And we provide seasonal paid positions for people who've been through our programs where they do habitat restoration and a little bit of environmental education as well. So that's what we do at LA Audubon. And Brian has more to add as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. So Brian, would you like to go next?
All right, hello, everyone. My name is Brian Young. Pronouns are he, him. So for my object, it's also my background. So this is a beach called Dockweiler, and it's one of the big spots we work at. This beach is about 12 miles from the center of LA. And to me, this beach is a microcosm of environmental racism for many levels. So one, I just mentioned how far it was. So 12 miles is not a great distance. But because of working conditions, traveling, getting access, there are people who lived in LA all their life and never gotten down to the beach. So that's one of the big problems. Two, you have to think about the idea of like a watershed and how all the water in the city eventually finds its way out to the ocean. And that's one of the big terminus areas. So you have all of that pollution coming from the city reaching down to the beach. And then you have the design of the beach itself. So if you guys don't know, most beaches in California historically were not flat. They had sand dunes and vegetation. But people saw the idea of beaches in movies and in Hollywood, and they got used to that. So that's what they wanted. So our beaches are like actually bulldozed to get that kind of look. And so we're doing so much like harm to this area without people having the proper knowledge of what this area was like before, how to take care of it. And that just continues to grow on because more and more people come to the beach just for fun. So they don't have that knowledge of how connected everything is. So to me, that's one of the biggest impacts of environmental racism. So like Emily mentioned, we bring people down to these places, we give them lessons, and then we teach them how to properly care for it. But we also try to keep the fun. So that's a delicate balance for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. But yeah, I mean, we've changed so many places that are supposed to be different naturally, just to fit our ideal movie-like images. So yeah. Rafaela, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Well, I come from Bolivia, and I think that defines a little my position. Well, and my object is more, for analysis, more global. I present this ship well, imagine that it's more realistic and an old European one. Well, are present as a symbol of environmental racism, actually because it is related with its origin, and it's based on an analysis posted by Malcolm Ferdinand. Well, this post-colonial Caribbean author writes that in the face of an ecological storm, there are those who will climb onto a Noah's Ark to stay safe and leave the war. However, what contrasts this scenario is a slave ship in which, at the slightest suspicion of a storm, some slaves are tied to the bridge, while others are thrown into the sea to release weight. So I think this shows a little in a global way a double rupture. He writes that a double rupture persists between those who fear the ecological storm on the horizon and those for whom the bridge of justice is refused long before the fear gusts appear. So I think this is precisely this rupture, this double break, environmental and colonial, that marks a new configuration of the war and that consolidates and divide us between white and non-whites, metropolis and colonies, and finally, in a global way, in north and south. So this is why I present the ships, because I think this slave ship in which is also a ship in which colonizers are arriving in South America. So I think it's not only the beginning of a genocide that colonization and slavery meant, but also the transformation of the war into a giant factory. The beginning of the great exploitation of ecosystems and humans for whom the war was denied. So I think it's how I see environmental racism. So as the inequality that exists both in the distribution of resource and environmental functions, but also in the cost of exploitation and environmental degradation that fall on the poorest sector, which are generally racialized and discriminated. And well, in my work, I try to build and to produce a decolonized science, in this case, ecology, because I think this decolonization it's very, very important in academia for that and to produce a science that will not reproduce environmental racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. I'm sure our audiences also share your feeling in that case. And welcome to Mr. Wilson. So our current question, if you have an item to share that represents environmental racism to you, would you like to go next? Thank you.
Am I audible? Hi, I am from India and my name is Beswada Wilson. I work with the manual scavenging community, the community which deal with the human shit in India, and the cleaning, carrying, disposing human excreta from the dry latrines, outskirts, and drains. This is a occupation for the untouchables in the country. So those untouchables are particularly from the community which is also put in the scheduled, they call as a scheduled, or the Dalits. That is the word. These communities are major generation to generation, they will be carrying the human excreta and doing this work. And we do clean the drains and underground drainage system. But the problem here, most of the underground drainage water we are not treating. The untreated drainage water is mostly is going to the rivers just like that, which is also polluting. And the human excreta which they collect and they throw on the dumping yards outside without any treatment. So there is an environmental pollution, and the people who carry this kind of a task or the occupation were forced to do that. Majority of them are 90% are the women. So there is a patriarchy, there is a caste, and there is a racism. So this gives a kind of although the constitution says that this is an equality, liberty and fraternity, but this kind of an activity or the work which actually denies all the liberty, equality, and all. This racial discrimination, which is a continuing generation to generation. I also belong to such one of the families. My father and mother were also the scavengers, and the people do die. We can discuss that later. So the discrimination continues, and the racism is also a part very clearly, predominantly dominating the society.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And as an Indian myself, I couldn't agree more. There are a lot of changes that we need to bring. So thank you to all the panelists. Let's move on to our next section. Our first question. So with globalization, environmental racism is increasing everywhere, and there is an unprecedented dumping of pollutants. And according to research, nearly 80% of pollutant e-waste generated gets transported to Asia and other such developing parts of the world. So who, according to you, benefits from environmental racism? And how is this enacted in everyday life for individuals as well as for institutions or companies? Emily, would you like to begin?
Yeah, so who benefits? Yeah, the wealthy, the companies, the people who have lots and lots of money, they have the power to I want to use one example. Like, let's say, I know in East LA there was a problem with the East LA community that had an increase of asthma, of cancer, and it was a solution. It was due to a company called Exide, which is an oil company, who placed themselves there. And they placed themselves there because it's a low income community. They had the money to buy land and to put their company there, affecting the health of the people around there. Um, so those are one of it. For us specifically for park access, people who benefit are people who have the time. So a lot of the low income people are working all the time that they don't even have time to take the kids or to even go to the park areas. Lack of transportation. People, usually wealthier people have cars that they can easily drive to these places. LA has a really great bus system. However, there is still some missing routes that take us directly to parks. So while all the buses go to downtown LA, which is great and all, but we need, direct bus stops at the parks. And I know they are working on that. And yeah, I think it's just the companies who are putting these places here who are, we talked about e-waste, those who are just uh advertising, buying all this electronics that we're buying, every 2 years. Like they're releasing these phones every year too. So yeah, it's just the wealthy companies that, have money and have the power to just place themselves anywhere that they feel like it.
Definitely, Emily. The corporate saga continues. Would you like to go next, Brian?
Yeah, I'll go next. So to piggyback off of that, I would also say, yeah, it's a lot of the corporations and people who are already rich. So like Emily said, we have a really, really good public transportation system, but it actually used to be even better back in the day. And what happened was the automotive industry gutted out a lot of our public service, public transportation to help promote cars and promote that lifestyle. And that's one of the other things that happens is that these people are able to influence like just not where this stuff goes, but how people view it, how they interact with it. So a lot of people who are affected by environmental racism don't even know what's going on. Again, the part of the place we work at is right next to a big oil field, and to a lot of people around here, that's a normal everyday thing. So they might not even like relate any of the health concerns they have to that oil rig being there. And then these same people have, since they have control of the media a lot of the time, what you'll see them do is promote all of the nice gentrified areas and then just discount any of the other rundown areas that are been ignored or that way because of policies that are unfair and unjust. So then you have this like perpetual loop. So yeah, a lot of corporations and the rich.
Definitely. And to tie together both of those answers, I think quite a lot of stuff that comes into play here is privilege, because the people who have privilege can simply manage to avoid the effects of environmental racism. And that brings me to Rafaela, because you were talking about decolonizing structures. So privilege is something that would also play quite a bit into that. So do you have a comment on that or whatever you would like to share?
Yeah, I think, well, first, I totally agree with Emily and Brian. Those who benefit from the environmental racism are generally the large corporations, companies, and even some institutions that receive these profits from the exploitation of the nature and the human. So I think it's also very important to think about this decolonization. I will explain a little. I think there is another type of environmental racism because that is not very well known. And I think the environmental racism that comes from some environmental organizations. That's not bizarre, but I will explain. There are some environmental organizations and NGOs that, far from seeking environmental or sociological justice, reproduce domination and exercise environmental racism by assessing the Black and Indigenous communities the role of taking care of nature. So I think that while they make invisible their poverty and vulnerability, so they make fall not only the cost of exploitation, but even the cost of environmental action on most vulnerable sectors. For example, I will show you an example in South Africa. Many of these organizations there go so far as to oppose human rights to nature conservation, often prioritizing the conservation over access to water or electricity for indigenous communities. So there is also a colonial vision here, because those indigenous people who demand their rights are the bad guys, while those who support conservation over their rights are the good indigenous people. So this is the myth of the good indigenous people. In general, I think there are also two scales on which the racism is exercised. Historically and geopolitically, the countries of the global north, well, the decolonizing countries, exercise more environmental racism on the colonizing countries of the global south. However, I think also within the countries or in the north and the south, there is a systematic reproduction of environmental racism against indigenous and the Black people. I think it's very important to remark that this racialization is not only a color scheme based, but it's also at ethnic and cultural, it's determined by ethnic and cultural factors. Well, and finally, at the individual and collective level, I think this environmental racism manifests in the idea that only individual actions, for example, do not use plastic, is the most important for the planet. This conception not only makes visible the great ecological impact of large corporations, of the industrial production and on the global world system, but it reproduces colonial oppression and social inequalities in access to resources, to water, and to electricity. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. And that's true, especially in our field of academics. We often consider that responsibilities and rights to protect their respective natural resources and communities should be assigned to, especially the indigenous communities that reside in the area. But not as often do we think about the pressure that puts on their capacities to actually do that task. So that's definitely something really important that we need to consider, and perhaps we'll do that in this panel. And you also mentioned about the human rights. And that actually brings me to Mr. Wilson, because human rights are something that are violated very often for manual scavengers. Mr. Wilson, if we still have you, I think maybe there's There we go.
Yeah. One more important thing which I also want to discuss, one is about the who are going to benefit out of this whole thing. The dominant caste and the rich, they are just, it is like a free blank check. They are getting the very cheap labor, and they are restricting the access for the untouchables and the others for the any natural resources, employment, education. So that discrimination is a kind of a blank check for them to exercise more and more power on the powerless people. And there is no power sharing, and they still build more and more hierarchies. Such hierarchies make the poor much more vulnerable, thereby they are not even thinking of they can fight back. So there are no hopes to even to fight, and their rights were completely denied. There is an act which prohibits the human scavenging, but they will not punish even a single person. So thereby they can continue, they can perpetuate even without any kind of a fear. They can ask any person to come and clean. And there, when they are coming and cleaning also, there isn't a right to live with the dignity, Article 21 Indian Constitution. But the people who are cleaning the sewage and manholes, they do often get choked and they are dying. An average of almost like a 200, the manual scavengers, every year they lose their life. But government will not make any investment to mechanize or modernize, because the people who are cleaning are untouchables. So they have them in mind. There is we can discriminate them forever. So thereby we get the power. And once they start exercising power, they feel also superior. We are a superior. The feeling of superior is then a cause for the racial discrimination. That continues. Then the whole atmosphere in the society, the whole environment is become like a place for the exploitation. That is thereby the racism still continues in different forms in India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. And yes, power and its effects on dignity, I think not only for India, that reflects in every country, especially in the developing countries, which still struggle with this huge class divide with the rich and the poor and the widening gap in between them, which also just adds up to what in India we face as caste. In perhaps in America, you would face it just as an economic divide, but then that all should just function to bring us all together to fight back. So that brings me to my next question. How do we combat environmental racism? Policies, practices at local, national, international levels need to be changed or created to dismantle these inequalities of access to sustainable development that we're talking about, and to prevent environmental racism and the exposure that people have to the effects of environmental degradation. So I ask you, what, in your perspective, all of us as and all the people out there who are facing the consequences of environmental racism, and all the people here in international Geneva, perhaps, and everywhere else, take action. So, Emily, we can begin with you.
Yeah, there is no one way of combating environmental racism. There's so many aspects to it. We can't do it overnight. This is something that's, systematic and or systemic, actually, sorry. However, the fortunate part is that there's many different organizations, I know specifically in Los Angeles, that focuses on different things, because we can't all do everything all at once. There's organizations that are trying to expand some of the parks, some of the mountains that we have, to make it more recreational. We have people fighting for regulations for buffer zones. So the thing about oil wells, I showed you how the yellow part are Inglewood oil fields, where specifically there's 956 oil wells here. However, the company has also placed random oil wells all throughout the city, and some of them even try to cover them with walls and try to even make murals around them. They're trying to hide them. So there's organizations that are trying to, close them down and or create buffer zones. There's some there's one that's right next to elementary school. For us, for LA Audubon, we do focus. So a lot of people identify Audubon as birds, which is true. Like Audubon focuses on conservations of birds, but with LA Audubon, we do that through education, and we also have the lens of accessibility to parks, not only for migratory birds, but for people as well. So the way we do it is that not only like we try to provide as much as we can paid opportunities, because if you want to get people involved, we have to pay people, especially if they're Black, Indigenous, people of color. A lot of people are looking for volunteerism, which is great and all, but if you can pay them, like, let's pay us. So that's one thing, is helping them also to, like, do resume building to get a career path. Is by paying people for their knowledge, for their work that they're doing. And then we do that through education and in our seasonal position. So the great thing about our programs is that not everyone who's in our programs are they're all environmentalists, but they're not all in the career of conservation. Specifically our high school program, we have people since 2008, which is when I joined. We've had about 350 people who've joined our high school program, and they're all in different career paths, which is totally okay. You can be in a career path in medicine and dental and engineering, and we all have the goal of caring about nature in our city. So, that's why I really like this panel, because we have people from all over the world with their perspectives of how combating environmental racism, and what we do is just one aspect of it. Well, and then it all contributes to combating environmental racism.
Thank you, Emily. I would actually like to ask you a follow-up question, because to go back to the beginning of what you said, to fight environmental racism systemically. But as both you and Brian mentioned, it's primarily corporates, especially in the American context, majorly corporates which are profiting from the existence of environmental racism. And often we see corporates exert quite a major influence on systems and institutions. So how would you suggest we go about just fighting the idea of the corporate control that is on systems if we're progressing systemically here?
How do we fight the corporates? Well, like I said, in LA, there's many people who are fighting against the corporates. In East LA, there's people who shut down Exide in their community. Right now, they are working on cleaning up Exide, cleaning up the area where it is, because they shut down, but they just left it. So it really is up to the people. So we really depend on the community. So we have to work with the community. For us, I feel like we give the tools to kind of become knowledgeable about the ecology of our area, to protect it, to become advocates for the ecologies that we have. So specifically at Los Angeles Audubon, we are not the big guys that are fighting the corporates, but we are providing tools and working with the community on how to care for our own communities. And maybe Brian has more to say about that question. Thank you, though.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, I'm sure all of us are just have that need. You have to fight the corporate ideal and structure. But Brian, would you like to follow up on that and continue the answer?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest ways to fight the corporate is to provide that knowledge for people. So one of the things we get a lot of bringing families up to the parks and out to the beach is that this is their first experience in nature. This is their first connection. And if you don't have that connection to start with, you don't realize just how much the companies and corporations are doing to the surrounding area and our effect, hurting you and the environment. So that's one of the biggest places to start, is like trying to foster that connection as early as possible. And if you can't catch them early, you can always catch them. We have people who like in their 70s who join our program and go, "Oh, I had no idea." So yeah, from there, that's I think is the best place to start. And hopefully over time, you get that ball rolling and you'll start seeing more people carry the torch towards being politicians and people in these companies who can go and create that kind of change from the inside. So yeah, so biggest thing I can think of is just continue spreading the knowledge and trying to grow more environmentalists.
For sure, community building has to take its precedence and take priority. Let's continue. Rafaela, would you like to share your answer?
Yeah. Well, in a regional and local level, a policy system can be focused in two directions. On one hand, in a general way, sure that equitable distribution and all resources provided by ecosystem, for example, water, electricity, education, etc. And on the other hand, it must be also ensured that the cost of the exploitation of ecosystems and resources will not affect most vulnerable groups. An essential part of these policies, I think, involves ensuring the real representation of indigenous and Black communities, which can or generally do not have access to decision-making spaces, and they are invisible or only be interpreted by individuals. And finally, I think it's also important in the academic world. I believe that it's fundamental to rethink a decolonized ecology that will not reproduce these environmental races. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela, for sure. Representation alongside community building is you give power and a voice to the people who are affected. And so, giving voice, Mr. Wilson, you are working to give voice to manual scavengers and their communities. So, would you like to share how you believe we can fight environmental racism?
There is the struggle is just too long. It is not a short, because it is also happened almost like thousands of years. The structure has become like this, and it is an unequal structure, and there is no doubt, and there is no scope for the equality unless until the marginalized, discriminated communities are coming together. If it is not coming together, the structural changes is a very difficult to push. We may make some law or some act or some covenant or a kind of a proceeding, but that is not going to resolve the whole problem, because here the structural construction is from the national level to the international level to back again to the provincial counts all, and to the hamlet level, at the village, at the hamlet level also. There is an structurally, there is an built with the hierarchy. So there is a no sense of equality. There is no respect for the equality. We say that we are all one, but deep to heart there is something. We are all one, but Asians are not as equal the Europeans, and we are all Europeans are all one, but within the Europe also there are the certain cities we are much more superior. So we built on that. Unless until that value system we somehow make a structural changes, it is not just one act by the SEDA or the SED or something, that elimination of the racial discrimination, that is not just sufficient. It has to go to the actually the younger generation, the youth. They must be given very clear that they have to build their life and the future with the notion of the other respect of the equality. They must say that everything should be equal. If there is no equality, there is no future, like that kind of a thing, one. And second is, without building or organizing the marginalized, scattered communities, it is a very difficult to fight against the a kind of a mighty corporate. Like corporates are becoming a small to the national and international, and they become like a giant like, and it become like a multinational, that national, international, global, whatever it is. But for whereas for the discriminated communities, there is no any global platform for the discriminate. There is a for all these things. That to happen, as Ambedkar said very clearly, we have to organize, we have to educate, we have to agitate. All these three together, if we are coming within a building a new world order where there is no discrimination, where there is no racism, where there is no patriarchy, where there is no caste. So there is a hope. I do say that we must always think that there is a hope, but it is a long walk to freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And yes, definitely, we're here to take up arms on this fight now. And New World Order, that is something we fight for every day. And especially here at the Graduate Institute, that's what we're here for every single day here. And you mentioned the role of youth. So that actually brings me to my next question. In today's age, studying the environment has become an important part of academia. Do you think that there is a gap between academia and the activism that you all practice? The European Union itself, for example, has a huge proportion of environmental racism cases. And as students of environmental studies here in Europe, and even in other countries, how would you say we can contribute to the movement against environmental racism? Emily?
Is there a gap? I feel like by personal experience, and I've heard from others, is that sometimes we learn more outside of academia, but obviously it's not true for everything. But sometimes it's our own experiences. Like we see it before people like study it or they're researching it. It's the people who have, you know, the academia is putting into words what people are living through. And I'm sorry, what was the last question?
It was just, I mean, we as students, how would you say we can contribute to the movement against environmental racism?
Yeah. First is to kind of become knowledgeable of like the communities you want to work with. Every community is working against something different. Like it might all have the same goal, but the way we're working on it is completely different. And what's really important is listening to the community. You know, just not coming in out of nowhere to, you know, say, hey, here's the problem, because they might know already because they're experiencing it. So I think it's really important for everyone to work together for decision making. So the scientists, the community, students, if they're part of the community, we all have to work together towards our one common goal. Because yeah, researchers can give all this data, but the data won't mean anything if you're not working with the community. So that's what I have to say about that one.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, we're here to listen. Brian, would you like to answer the question?
So there's a old African American saying, study long, study wrong. And I think that applies here, where yeah, there's a gap between like the practical activism and academia. It's like you can study everything so much, but until you put it into practice, you'll never truly know if it works or not. So it's more of a getting this back and forth conversation between the two areas where one doesn't overshadow the other. I feel like a lot of time, a lot of academics become too, I don't know what the word is, bold, I guess would be good. And you, like Em would say, you have all the research, so you're trying to base it off what you're doing off of what that's telling you, but you're not getting the lived experience of the people there and trying to understand their perspective and like why they're changing things a certain way or how they're trying to like push back. So I think it's just tightening up that like dichotomy that'll get us there.
Definitely, we need to bring in actual field exposures and to listen to communities into our curriculums. And As I mentioned curriculums, Rafaela, especially from your perspectives about decolonizations, do you think that also has an impact on the way we are understanding the issues as academics?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important. Definitely think there is a gap between science or academia and activism, but even I think environmental activism and colonial activism are separate, and I think this is a problem. So I think it's very important to decolonize our approach in ecology and even in activism because we are used to separate these issues. And I think it's necessary to think as a global issue and that it is important to achieve equality and also sustainability. And it's impossible to achieve these fights in an isolated way. So I think as students, it's important to be critical, to try to have decolonization of the science, of the academia, but also to try to be really inclusive to try to make our academic spaces more inclusive, more open to these people, to our people, with all Black people, indigenous people, and to try to think and to act with this global way. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. Yes, we criticize. I think Mr. Wilson isn't here right now. He just goes on. That's okay. I think let's wait for a few seconds for Mr. Wilson and in the meanwhile, just for the audiences to sum up to now, what we've discussed so far especially about the academia feature, the academia question is that we as academics, as students and as researchers need to be more present in the communities that are actually affected to be able to better understand and to work for them, the issues and the consequences that they face. And only then can we be the bridge between the communities and the organizations that can actually bring in the forces and make that impact. And we as a community too need to work together to bring change and to decolonize. We need to decolonize our curriculums. And in fact, that, especially at the Graduate Institute, has been a rising debate on how we definitely need to decolonize our curriculum. So perhaps we can push further on that. I don't see Mr. Wilson yet. Yeah. Yeah. So perhaps we can move on. Oh, no, there we go. Mr. Wilson, would you like to answer the academia questions?
There is another thing is when I also missed one more thing, that is about the youth and the academics. They both. I think that there is a digital revolution when it is all taking place, and the communication has become a quick and fast, and the youngsters are very quick to learn many things. But here we are going very in the activism. We go with the cloth bag and very simplicity, all these things, and even now the pamphlet, all those things. That is then one obstacle we are not reaching. And another thing is, there is an academic level, the people also, they have to develop a kind of a syllabus. See, we have already the syllabus, how we can get discriminated and how we can exploit the people. There is so much, the syllabus is there, but there is no such syllabus, non-exploitative methods and non-discriminatory methods. And that syllabus which is coming as an equality, dignity, self-respect, that is not coming. So because we have to make everybody to understand openly that if you are thinking somebody is down to you or something and you are a superior, that is a kind of they also psychologically become like a slaves. So you just think that somebody is not equal to you. That is, they are also slaves. So as we can very clearly think that their freedom, our freedom is a link. So you unnecessarily think that I am a lawyer than you. That is not just my problem, it is ultimately your problem too. So there must be a kind of a syllabus and a very clear understanding. How do we make a self-respect and dignity of every citizen? Every individual is a matters. Every life matters. Everybody's dignity and self-respect also matters.
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. In fact, that brings us back to our first thing when we mentioned privilege, the privilege to access the kinds of accurate curriculums and the absence of the just, equal, and accurate syllabuses and curriculums there. We have a lot of questions from the audience, so let's quickly move on to the audience Q&A section. The questions are up for any panelist who wants to answer them, and we would request you to keep the answers brief. Ali?
Just first wanted to say thank you all panelists for all of your amazing thoughts so far, and they've really been initiating a lot of great conversations. So one question we have here is, are any of you accessing UN human rights system to assist your work? For example, the UN Special Rapporteurs on toxic waste and on human rights and on the environment, for example, or the Universal Periodic Review, or any other human rights mechanisms in your work? And anyone's free to just hop in if you want to speak. And if you're not accessing that, maybe you could speak on that as well.
No, I don't think we've been using any of that in our program. However, we have been looking at stuff like the Paris Accord and trying to like just break down that to our students. So yeah, we do look at a lot of different things and just try to sit with people and work through the language of that stuff, because a lot of that type of phrasing is not common to them.
A follow-up question from that, coming from one of our attendees, was for Brian and Emily specifically, do you see a change possible in your struggle within in making progress with the new US administration? And if yes or no, why?
Yeah, I do see some opportunities for change. Just off the basis of that the last administration was so like anti-science, so anti-environmental, that they removed a lot of protections and a lot of stuff people fought for. And now we're seeing them return. One of the big victories was getting the Keystone pipeline finally shut down. That has been a big fight for years. So there's already some movement forward.
Thank you for coming, Emily. We have heard some amazing things from you, and we hope to keep the conversation going in perhaps future events with you as well. Thank you so much. Emily, you're muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that, yeah, I have to go, but just to follow, just wanted to mention that, yeah, with the new administration, we have, we're very optimistic about having, it's pro climate change, like they're talking about climate change, which, the other ones did not believe in. So we have optimism on changes for park access, for better air quality, and all of that. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. And I put my email down for anybody who wants to chat. I know everyone's in different parts of the world, but we do teach a free course about conservation studies, specifically in the US and California. So if anybody's interested in that, please email me. But yeah, bye everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for being here. Farewell. Okay, so I'll ask one more question before we start moving into breakout rooms, and Arvine will explain that later. So a question that I'd like to pose to all the panelists, I think it's very relevant to kind of some of the other activism work questions we've been talking about. The question is, do you think the climate change activism and discourse that is kind of dominant, is that inclusive of environmental racism? Why or why not? And if not, what changes in this discourse do you think need to be made? So yeah, Rafaela, please feel free.
Yeah, I think very interesting this question. I think the international committee and in an international level, there was not a really equity or global vision in the fight against climate change. For example, and Bolivia was with Ecuador was two countries that achieved the formation of an international platform of indigenous people in the United Nations framework, the Convention of Climate Change. So it was years ago. So, for example, the indigenous people are the most affected communities in the world by climate change, and they didn't have a real space to discuss and to be part of the decisions in an international level. So I think it's very important to show that it was not a really equal space into discussion. It was the government, some NGOs, but there was not a real space to representation for indigenous people. So I think, for example, that is an important example of what countries can do, but also that it's possible to move on. It's possible to build a better way of negotiation even. But there is a lot to do, even because in this platform there has to be support for these indigenous to arrive to the COP, to the international negotiation. Even in a way, I think there is not still a really equitable space, but it's possible to achieve, I hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Rafaela. Mr. Wilson or Brian, would you like to speak on this topic?
I just want to make one more thing is there is a need to build a kind of a linkages between the marginalized communities across the globe at the same time in many regional levels. It is not just in a global one level, and there must be some understanding and experiences sharing, and that has to be taken into the priority because there are the struggles which are giving a good result that has to be intimated or informed to the other marginalized. That gives a hope again for the many exploited communities here across the globe. And second is a solidarity support of the people who believe in the human rights must be channelized in the proper channel. And that has to come. And international agencies also must take this as a priority, and environmental racism is actually how it is affecting globally. That also we have to take it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian, do you have any extra things to add there?
Yeah, I think there's a growing debate with it, but like conservation, especially in America, comes from like a history of like cis hetero white males. So a lot of it is based in like that perspective on what it means to conserve or what racism is. So we have to, like again mentioned before, like decolonizing that kind of language and those kind of thoughts of how you use this space or natural spaces. So yeah, there's definitely a disconnect, and we are seeing more inclusivity come in and start to rewrite how we do things.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you everyone for the amazing questions. I'm sure our audiences have more questions, but we'll move on to the next segment. While we were planning this event, our team was considering how to give attendees the best shot at understanding and reflecting upon what we've heard today. So for our next segment, we will be sending all attendees into breakout rooms with one panelist assigned at random, where you can reflect on the discussion so far and ask any questions that you have to the panelists that you've been assigned with. I would ask you to please press the Join Now button that will show up on your screen any moment now. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had fruitful and interesting discussions in your breakout sessions. We will quickly do a debrief of what went on in the respective breakout rooms. So let's begin with, well, I can begin, I guess, to go in the same order. So what went on in our breakout room, we had a session with Brian, and what we talked about was how, in particular, in individuals who that society is kind of sections away, like refugees especially, are just pushed into dangerous areas, and how that is common across countries. Like Mr. Wilson brought up untouchables in India, and that is common across countries. People just push away certain communities. And we talked about what can be interpreted as the privileges that people in developed versus developing countries have, and their access to more sustainable or organic or better in general quality of products and items, and how the economies of the particular kinds of products that you can access vary over developing and developed countries. And we had a discussion also about how a lot of people who are affected by environmental racism might or might not know what is going on. And we also talked about how in communities like Switzerland, for example, where their green spaces are particularly more than certain other countries would have, how do you bring the community into the space of engaging with environment when they already have access? So what Brian had to answer for that one was to just teach them how to enjoy nature, and once COVID is over, of course, to encourage more travel and connecting with natural spaces that are outside of their comfort zones and their usual access, so they can better understand the differences and the impacts that the people are facing. And one very important aspect that we discussed was that to bring people into this field and to bring more action, we need to actually monetize these particular jobs or tasks, and how making them paid instead of just voluntary would actually attract quite a lot more people than just the avid, passionate people that we are right here. Would someone like to go next?
I can go next. In my breakout room, Karen wonderfully moderated the discussion. We had Rafaela in it, and we talked about, like Daniela talked about, Mexico's issue and the access to clean water. And she talked about how there is no access to, like 80% of the population doesn't have access to clean water, and how it is a human rights issue. And Perrine talked about how we are forgetting about the issue of ecology, and we talk less about ecology. And she's working or studying, I think, at the Sustainable Development Institute, but there is less discussion about it. And then we had Rafaela talking about her personal experiences in Spain, and how even though she came from a bit of privileged background, but she was aware of the indigenous people there and their struggles and suffering. And she also mentioned a very good point that there is never too late to know about these issues, and we can always get to know about the issues and start doing something about it. And in the end, there was a wonderful feedback from Ravindra Singh Sodhi ji. She talked about that how in southern India now there is a solution that has come for robots, like for manual scavenging, and now they have robots which can clean the human excreta from sewage. But the main issue is that till the time we don't have political will, till the time maybe the Indian parliamentarians don't have the will to change the situation will not change. And coming back to what Bezwada ji was also saying about the issue that even if we pass laws, it will not change till we don't come and bring a momentum against these environmental racism issues.
Right, Petra?
Right. So in our discussion, somebody posed the question of whether environmental racism can be approached from the top down and still be able to include the voices of indigenous communities and communities at the bottom. And to that, Mr. Wilson answered that it's very difficult for that to happen. Usually there's not much political will, and sometimes communities don't even know what is being discussed. So similar to what some other people discuss in the other breakout rooms, people might not even know that they are facing environmental racism. Another thing that we talked about was the in many ways, discrimination starts from the very beginning. In the case of India, the caste system is pervasive in all fronts. Mr. Wilson was saying that it's sometimes it's part of the person's name, so that already gives a reason for people to be discriminated against, and treated differently. We talked a bit about how the legal and bureaucratic approaches to addressing environmental racism are kind of exhausting in some cases, and there's the lack of representation in governments is a challenge that makes it even more difficult. And then towards the end, we talked a little bit about the farmers' protests in India and how they share a struggle with environmental racism in a sense, because they are fighting against the corporate interests in the production of agriculture and whatnot.
All right, thank you. That is all we have time for today. We hope you all keep the discussion and action going and keep fighting environmental racism. I would like to extend a huge thank you to our expert guests and event attendees for joining us today, and we hope the event has inspired you in some way, whether that means taking action or thinking about things from a new perspective. A quick reminder that you can explore and register for our remaining Sustainability Week events on your screen right now. And we'll put the links in the chat. The links to our social media channels will also be shared in the chat, and please follow us to stay up to date regarding our events throughout the year, as well as receive updates next year. Thank you very much for coming.